Hi, I'm Tom Shannon, husband, father, grandfather, pastor, teacher, and licensed professional counselor. As your host, I'd like to welcome you to Simply Grace, where our focus is on a simple truth that God's grace defines and empowers us, impacting virtually every aspect of God's kingdom in our lives. God's grace is for all, in all, and through all, whether we realize it or not. God demonstrated His grace in His work of creation and in relating with His creation. Grace has also been a foundational aspect of Christianity from its beginning. Unfortunately, over time, grace, like so many other aspects of Christianity, became clouded due to men complicating God's simplicity. In Matthew 18:3 and 4, Jesus relates God's simplicity and its importance to becoming like little children, saying, "Learn this well. Unless you dramatically change your way of thinking and become teachable and learn with the wide-eyed expectancy and wonder of a child, you will never be able to enter in. Whoever continually humbles himself to become like this gentle child is the greatest one in kingdom's realm." If a child can't understand it, it's too complicated. We need to keep it simple. We need to keep grace simple. It's simply grace, which is this program's focus. Before we talk about grace, it's important to take a moment to talk about why we complicate God's simplicity. Complication arises out of a desire to control or be controlled. This may be a new concept, so let me explain. In Eden, the serpent, desiring to control God's creation, attempted to control Eve. His method of control was a lie, and not just any lie, but the lie. He deceived Eve into believing she wasn't God's image. Then he offered her a quick fix, to be like God. She just had to do something. She had to eat the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Eve took the bait. After all, what could be so bad with wanting to be more like God? But how can one become more of what they already are? Genesis 1:27 and 28 reveals Adam and Eve were created in God's image. They were like God. And Genesis 2:25 adds that they were naked and they knew no shame. They lacked nothing. They were shameless, just as God is shameless. But Eve, believing the lie and acting on it, changed everything. Being deceived by the serpent, Eve believed the lie, falling under its control. Eve now perceived herself in a new way, as an individual outside of her oneness, her union in God and Adam, which she had always known. But this new reality was a deception. It was a delusion. It wasn't real, but she embraced it just as if it was. She now saw herself as isolated, separated from God, and separated from Adam. They were no longer one. Along with her newfound identity as an individual, she began to experience feelings of being incomplete, less, flawed, unlovable, and unworthy. She experienced the pain of separation. Her simple life became complicated. These new feelings were uncomfortable. She needed to control them. She couldn't fix it within, so she had to fix it outside of herself. Her solution seemed to be a noble one. It was to draw Adam into her separation so he too could be like God, and then she wouldn't feel separated and alone. After all, it's not good for the man to be alone. She reached out her hand holding the forbidden fruit, gave it to Adam, who was with her, and Adam ate, joining her in her separation, and the two once again became one, but not the one God intended. Adam loved Eve and was grieved over the unbelievable events unfolding before his eyes. He had to act. Being one with Eve, it's reasonable to assume he sensed the lie's effect on her. He had to do something about it, but what? He knew the result of eating the tree of knowledge was death. And whatever that was, he didn't want her to experience it. Consumed with anguish and being one with God, one can assume he sensed God's love and anguish. He sensed God's love and grace speaking to him. There is no greater love than laying down one's life for his friends. But he didn't quite know what to make of it. Instead of trusting God to fix the problem, Adam took matters into his own hands. Out of his anguish, confusion, and love, in haste, Adam took the forbidden fruit, Eve offered and ate, giving his life for his friend, joining in her death, hoping that his action would somehow save Eve as well as all creation. Adam attempted to control what the lie had undone. He failed. And men have been trying to fix and control things in their lives and the world around them ever since, experiencing similar results. You may say this is all speculation, but I think not. Paul describes this moment in Romans 8:20 and 21 in the English Standard Version. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. Some translations capitalize the H in him, making it refer to God. But is it referring to God? However, the ancient Greek texts were all written in lowercase letters. They did not capitalize the H in him. Here is speculating aligned with the translator's belief in theology. To answer this, let me ask you a simple question. Do you really believe God subjected his perfect creation, his passion, made in his image, his likeness, to bondage and corruption? Such a concept violates the very nature of God. It wasn't God, it was Adam that subjected creation and bondage, in hope of the freedom from bondage, and to once again embrace the freedom of the glory belonging to God's children. I could go into much greater detail here, but I'll save that for another time. The point I want to make is that God's truth can't be controlled, nor can it be hidden. God's light, life, love, truth, and grace will always break through the darkness, filling all with his glory, revealing his truth hidden deep within. Earlier I stated that God's grace is foundational in the church and God's kingdom reality. In this millennia, we've seen an increased focus and awareness on God's grace. Books, preaching, songs, grace churches, grace seminaries, and most recently, the first of its kind, an entire grace-focused streaming channel on Roku, GAN, the Grace Awakening Network, streaming to over 70 million homes across the world. This is an exciting and totally amazing occurrence. Why has there been such an increased focus on God's grace? I suggest it's because we need it. Grace is something Christians have always been very familiar with, but it's like so many other things, and all our familiarity, we really don't understand it. For me, being raised in church my entire life, I understood grace as being somehow connected with God's love, sanctification, mercy, forgiveness, and salvation. But what I didn't understand was exactly what grace was. Grace was just a nebulous concept, lacking clarity. I was taught grace is God's favor, which it is. But why did I need his favor? What was his grace for? I was confused. I remember sharing this with my pastor, that I didn't understand grace. He gave me all the answers I already knew, so I kept asking. It didn't take long, and I tired him out. He then bluntly told me, grace is not deserving what you get and not getting what you deserve. What? Whoa, I didn't expect that, and I didn't like the sound of it very much. It didn't add any clarity to my understanding of grace, and it made grace sound more confusing. It made God and his grace seem very distant, cold, uncaring, and unloving. It made me feel dirty, unworthy, unlovable, which is the opposite of what grace does. I was left feeling like I wanted to run and hide from God rather than spend any time with him. Sadly, there's many such concepts complicating God's grace and keeping us from seeing God as he truly is and experiencing his amazingly simple grace. As time went on, I became increasingly comfortable with not fully understanding grace. I began to see it as a cliche Paul used to introduce weightier theological concepts. Sadly, even Bible college didn't give me a better understanding of grace. but it did help me learn a lot about theology and doctrine as I dug myself deeper into embracing the religious status quo. I'm not suggesting doctrine and theology are bad, but like anything else, if they're not correctly understood, they can produce negative results. Looking back, the more knowledge I acquired, the more I became estranged from God's love and grace. I experienced what Paul described in 1 Corinthians 8:1-3 in the Passion Translation. It seems that everyone believes his own opinion is right on this matter. How easily we get puffed up over our opinions. But love builds up the structure of our new life. If anyone thinks of himself as a know-it-all, he still has a lot to learn. But if a person passionately loves God, he will possess the knowledge of God. I like that. The New King James says it this way: we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. And if anyone thinks he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. Wow, this described me, learning more and more, but knowing less and less. Church, Bible college, and my endless hours of Bible study taught me a lot about religion, but very little, if anything, about God's love or His grace. In all my knowledge I found I lacked both. In 2012, everything changed. After being raised in church my entire life, 30 years being a born-again Christian, and over 20 years of pastoring, I experienced what I call a grace awakening. It began with Joseph Prince and his teaching on grace. It opened my eyes. I began to know and experience God's love, forgiveness, and grace like never before. Over the next several months, God reconnected me with many of my church family that I hadn't seen in years. And guess what? They were going through a grace awakening too. We began having a grace Bible study together. And it wasn't long after this, the church I pastored began to experience a grace awakening too. It was an amazing time, but I don't want to spend too much time talking about this right now. Again, it's not that I didn't know about God's grace and love. I did. But in all my knowledge, I really didn't know them. If that makes any sense. I was confused. Can anyone relate? My journey in grace began with my realization that on the cross, Jesus demonstrated the fullness of His love, not just for some, but for all humanity. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 10, verses 12 and 13, the Passion Translation says, "But when this priest Jesus had offered the one supreme sacrifice for sin for all time, He sat down on a throne at the right hand of God. And by His one perfect sacrifice, He made us perfectly holy and complete for all time." Did you catch that? On the cross, Jesus forgave all our sins for all time. We're perfect and holy for eternity. And this is by Jesus and not ourselves. Even before we experienced our first breath, it's never been up to us. Rather, it's always been up to Him. This is God's grace. Many will stop me there and ask, but what about verse 13, which I didn't read? And it reads, "Waiting until all His whispering enemies are subdued and turn into His footstool." This seems to throw a wrench into Jesus forgiving everyone's sin for all time. But really it doesn't. In John 12:32 and 33, New King James Version, Jesus says, "And if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all peoples to myself." He said this to show the kind of death He was going to die. Did you catch that? Jesus was lifted up on the cross, and the result was drawing all humanity to Himself. All is all. So how could any human be His footstool? And then in John 15:13, the Passion Translation, "For the greatest love of all is a love that sacrifices all." And this great love is demonstrated when a person sacrifices his life for his friends. Jesus died for all. He died for those who considered Him their enemy. He died for those who murdered Him. Jesus counted all humanity as His friends, none excluded. The good news is that humanity has never been nor ever will be God's enemies or his footstool. So what about these enemies to be made his footstool? If it's not humanity, who or what could these enemies of God be? Paul reveals their identity in Romans 16:20, the Passion Translation. And the God of peace will swiftly pound Satan to a pulp under your feet. And the wonderful favor of our Lord Jesus Christ will surround you. God's footstool is the accusing serpent, Satan, and the lie which he introduced in Eden. The lie is that we're not like God and must do something to be like God. But we've always been like God. There's never been a time we haven't been like God. The lie has never been more powerful than God or God's truth. Even in Genesis 9:6, after the flood, God still sees man as his image. On the cross, the enemy and his lie were defeated. So why does Paul portray it as an event yet to be experienced? The God of peace will swiftly pound Satan to a pulp under your feet. It's because humanity has lived out of the lie rather than God's truth. We've believed that we're not God's image, that we need to do something to make ourselves more like God. We've not believed in Jesus' finished work on the cross. Embracing the reality of Jesus' finished work, we realize the enemy and his lies were defeated long ago. The result is we're immediately translated from despair, gloom, doom, into being surrounded in his love and favor. We begin to experience what has always been the enemy crushed beneath our feet. The fullness of his blessing surrounds us, and this is not our own doing. It's his doing. He's done it all. God's grace defines and empowers us over the enemy and his lies. It's never been up to us to change ourselves. It's always been Jesus' job. Jesus forgave our sin on the cross, and even from before the cross. Revelation 17:8 and 18:8 refer to Jesus as the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And 2 Timothy 1:9 in the New King James Version says that Jesus saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our own works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given to us in Christ Jesus before time began. God poured out his grace and dealt with our sin before our first breath, before our existence, before anyone ever existed. Now getting back to my grace awakening, I lived my life believing I was bound by sin. Sin is who I was. It was my identity. I lived in fear of what would happen if I failed to confess and ask forgiveness for my every sin. Sin only allowed me to love very little, and it showed. And then Jesus opened my eyes to see that on the cross, he demonstrated the fullness of his forgiveness of all sin for all time. From the cross, my sin, all humanity's sin, was forgiven for all time. Jesus revealed sin wasn't my identity. He was my identity, and his identity was love. Immediately, I was immersed in his love. There was nothing I could do to hide from it or escape it, as if I ever would want to. His love captivated me. For days, a single verse captivated my mind regarding the sinful woman anointing Jesus with oil. She knew her sin, and the Pharisees did as well, but it didn't stop her. Walking to Jesus, she ignored their judgmental glances and disdain. Approaching Jesus, she anointed him with oil, wept over his feet, dried them with her hair. The Pharisees were incensed, but she didn't care, and more importantly, Jesus didn't care either. I love what Jesus said regarding her. And now I heard it speaking to me, Luke 7:47, the English Standard Version. Behold, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. Realizing that my every sin, past, present, and future, were forgiven for all time, freed me to experience the fullness of his love and experience God's grace defining and empowering me. Finally, after all my years of seeking, I stumbled onto a religiously inconvenient truth. I experienced what Jesus declared in John 8:31 and 32, David Bentley Hart translation. So Jesus said to the Judeans who had faith in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. All my life I believed my quest for knowledge would bring me freedom, but all it did was bring more and more bondage. Saul, Paul's name before he encountered Jesus, was more knowledgeable than most Jews, and he came to realize the same thing. His grace knowledge didn't bring him any closer to God or open his eyes to Jesus. He was bound in religion and sin. It was meeting Jesus on the Damascus road that changed everything. The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is powerless to change men's lives for the better. The power is to pull us deeper into the lie, encountering Jesus and the fullness of his love, forgiveness, and grace that changes lives. Jesus is the only one who can fix Adam's mess. Encountering Jesus' love, forgiveness, and grace is how I experienced freedom after a lifetime of bondage. I suggest it's how all come to experience the true freedom of which Jesus speaks. Listen as he speaks to your heart. After decades of seeking to understand God's grace, his grace found me. Grace was never about my effort. It's always been about his effort. Grace has never been about our getting what we don't deserve and not deserving what we get. Grace is his honor and favor, his empowerment flowing from his love. It's relational and connected to his mercy, forgiveness, sanctification, and salvation. I love how Francois de Toy describes grace in the Mirror Translation, 1 Corinthians 15:10. While my own doing completely disqualified me, his doing now defines me. I am what I am by the grace of God. I am because he is. His grace was not wasted on me. Instead, I'm inspired to labor beyond the point of exhaustion. More than anything that I ever did under the law of performance, whatever it is that I accomplish now has grace written all over it. I take no credit for it. God's grace is simply amazing. It defines us, inspires us, and empowers us to action. Now let's talk about the word grace and what it is. For many, their first encounter with grace is we're not under law, but under grace. As foundational as this Christian belief is, and as important as it is, grace runs much deeper. Grace is more than merely a doctrine or teaching. It's the very heart and very nature of God. Grace, charis, and its counterpart in the Hebrew hen have like meaning. In the Complete Word Study Dictionary, New Testament, it states grace is particularly that which causes joy, pleasure, gratification, favor. It's a favor done without expectation of return. It's an absolutely free expression of the loving kindness of God to men, finding its only motive in the bounty and benevolence of the giver. It's honor and favor. Charis stands in direct antithesis to erga, works, the two being mutually exclusive. He adds that grace, a noun, comes from the verb chario, meaning to rejoice and be glad. Hence, a very important aspect of grace is that it's rooted in joy and gladness. If it lacks joy, it isn't grace. In Titus 2:11 and 12, the English Standard Version, Paul says, "For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and live worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives." Here Paul reveals grace as God's salvation for all, training for all, and empowered living for all. Looking at the Greek text, it communicates that God's grace shines brightly and openly for all to see, authentically revealing God, for preserving all from danger. It's morally and spiritually nurturing, empowering us to deny and refuse every aspect of the lie and the inauthentic identity. It births and empowers, allowing us to spend our lives, our existence, having sound and rational minds, living out of God-created authentic identity. Grace's result in us is that in all our relations with others, we might be just, honest, and non-injurious, living in authenticity like God. This is what grace is. Grace is an essential aspect of Christianity and God's kingdom. God has put it in the spotlight and is clearing up every misconception and complication about what it is. Grace is God's unmerited favor, expressing His unconditional love without any expectation of return. It's the outward expression of joy releasing His unconditional love in our lives. Grace is God's defining and empowering lives. Next time, we'll look at God's joy being our strength, what this means for us, and how we can experience it. Until then, always remember, God's grace defines and empowers lives. I am because He is. Enjoy His blessing.
Thank you for tuning in to Simply Grace with Tom Shannon. We appreciate your time and your commitment to living authentically as God designed you. For more resources to guide you on your journey in grace, please visit simplygrace.co. If you have been impacted by Simply Grace, we would be grateful for your prayers and ask for your support through a financial donation. Your generosity will help us continue spreading the message of God's grace locally and globally. Giving is simple and secure. Again, thanks for tuning in, and always remember, God's grace defines and empowers lives. I am because He is. Enjoy His blessing.
Simply Grace wants you to know that we care about you and want to help you in your grace walk. For a more personal and relational experience, we're excited to offer a Thursday night Zoom where we will discuss the material covered in that day's program and in the process get to know each other and hopefully make many new friends. We are also developing other relational opportunities, including our website and Facebook page. Feel free to send us an email at hello@simplygrace.co and let us know where you're listening from. If you're interested in our Zoom meetings, joining Zoom is easy. Just email your Zoom request by 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll email you a link. Just click on the link we send you as early as 6:50 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Connecting is easy on most computers, laptops, tablets, or smartphones. If Zoom isn't on your device, it's easily downloaded by clicking on the Zoom link we will send you. It should take less than 5 minutes to load. I look forward to meeting and getting to know each other. Have a blessed day.